The syringe glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights of the operating room. Dr. Elijah Moore leaned over his patient, the needle poised for the final step in a groundbreaking treatment. To anyone watching, it was just another procedure, another miracle in the making. But the real magic wasn't in the cure. It was in the deadly serum flowing through the needle, a lethal concoction he'd perfected after months of careful research. Dr. Moore wasn't just administering medicine. He was signing death certificates. Every patient on his list had been chosen with precision. CEOs, celebrities, doctors, those who once praised him, then turned their backs when his methods came under scrutiny. The city believed the sudden wave of deaths was nothing but bad luck. Heart attacks, strokes, and perfectly healthy people collapsing without warning. But Dr. Moore knew exactly when his creation would take effect. He tracked it, reading the headlines like a gallery of his work. And tonight, as another patient drifted under the anesthesia, he injected them with his final touch, knowing that within days, the tragedy would unfold. This is the story of the man who turned medicine into the deadliest weapon the world had ever seen. Welcome to my channel. Subscribe the channel and like the video. Dr. Elijah Moore had earned the kind of reputation most doctors could only dream of. His name was synonymous with innovation, success, and expertise. A man in his early 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, reassuring demeanor, Dr. Moore was widely regarded as a genius in the field of advanced medical treatments. People came to him not just for diagnosis, but for hope that their illnesses, no matter how rare or complex, could be cured. His clinic was a hub of constant activity, bustling with patients from all over the country who sought out the man who could heal the seemingly impossible. The waiting room was always full, filled with the anxious faces of patients who had heard the glowing reviews about his revolutionary treatments. The sleek, modern design of the clinic spoke volumes about his success. White marble floors that gleamed under the overhead lights, walls adorned with certificates and awards from prestigious medical societies, and a state-of-the-art treatment room that resembled more of a high-tech laboratory than a traditional doctor's office. The hum of machines and soft murmur of conversations filled the air as nurses moved swiftly between rooms, preparing Dr. Moore's patients for what they believed would be life-changing procedures. To the outside world, Dr. Moore was untouchable. His name carried weight, his clinic was full, and his success seemed to know no bounds. It wasn't just the patients who trusted him. Even his colleagues regarded him with awe, constantly impressed by his ability to diagnose complex conditions and propose treatments that no one else could. But as much as Dr. Moore's clinic was a beacon of hope to so many, something darker was slowly taking root beneath the surface, something that no one, not even his closest colleagues, could see coming. It was a subtle shift, one that went unnoticed at first, a creeping unease that settled into the clinic like a fog. While Dr. Moore's patients were eager to undergo his treatments, there was an underlying tension among his staff. It wasn't something anyone could pinpoint, not right away, but there was a quiet discomfort that began to hang in the air. One afternoon, as Dr. Moore was preparing for yet another round of consultations, Nurse Clara caught a fleeting conversation that would haunt her for weeks to come. The clinic had just admitted a new batch of patients, many of whom had come seeking treatment for rare conditions. Clara, who had been working alongside Dr. Moore for years, had grown accustomed to the routine patients arriving, being treated, and leaving satisfied. But this time, something was different. Something felt off. "I can't believe how many we've lost lately," Nurse Clara said, her voice low as she spoke to a fellow nurse in the break room. The conversation seemed innocent enough, but the words carried an edge that sent a chill down her spine. "This is the fourth one in the last month. All of them young, healthy, and active. All of them ... dead." Her colleague, a young nurse, who had only recently joined the clinic, looked around nervously, as though expecting someone to overhear. "But it's not Dr. Moore's fault, right? I mean, it could be a coincidence, right?" Clara bit her lip, hesitating. "I don't know, but something feels wrong. I don't know if it's the treatments or if I'm just overthinking it, but I've never seen this many deaths in such a short time. It's like no one is asking questions." The younger nurse nodded, but her face was pale. It was clear that she, too, felt the weight of Clara's words, but didn't know how to express it. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that builds when something unspoken hangs in the air, ready to break free. Clara had been in the medical field long enough to know that this was no mere coincidence. There was something sinister brewing beneath the calm exterior of the clinic. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But despite Clara's growing unease, no one else seemed willing to speak up. Dr. Moore remained the golden boy of the medical world, and everyone from the nurses to the patients trusted him implicitly. His success and reputation overshadowed any doubt, and the deaths were chalked up to rare complications or unpredictable outcomes. After all, Dr. Moore had a history of performing miraculous surgeries and saving lives that others couldn't. Surely, a few unexpected deaths couldn't undo his legacy. But even as the patients filed in and out, one by one, something darker simmered beneath the polished surface. Dr. Moore had recently introduced a new treatment, one that he claimed would revolutionize the medical field. It was something he had been working on for months, something that had been kept under wraps and carefully guarded. He called it a breakthrough therapy that could cure diseases considered terminal by traditional medicine. But while he spoke passionately about it to the press and patients alike, there was something he left unsaid. There were no clinical trials, no independent studies to support his claims. The treatment was still experimental, and yet Dr. Moore had begun using it on patients without the full validation from his peers. His reputation was so untouchable that no one questioned it. To Dr. Moore, the treatment wasn't just an innovation. It was a way to cement his place in medical history. He truly believed that what he was doing was for the greater good, even as the death toll slowly began to rise. He saw it as a necessary sacrifice, a few lives lost in the pursuit of medical greatness. After all, no one would remember the names of those who perished, but they would remember his name, the doctor who changed the world with a new, groundbreaking treatment. Yet, as the deaths continued to mount, whispers began to emerge among the staff, though they were hushed and quickly silenced. Clara's concerns grew louder in her mind, but she was too afraid to speak up. Dr. Moore had a way of silencing those who questioned him, either by dismissing their concerns with a smile or making them feel small for doubting his genius. No one dared to challenge him, not when his name was still on the lips of every patient, every journalist, and every doctor in the city. His fame and reputation had built a fortress around him, and no one was brave enough to knock it down. But as the clinic continued to hum with its usual rhythm, the cracks in the foundation were beginning to show. Clara couldn't ignore the warning signs anymore. The patients dying, the strange timing of their deaths, the way Dr. Moore spoke so fervently about the treatment. And yet, no one asked questions. No one cared to dig deeper, not when the doctor's name was a golden ticket to success. But Clara wasn't the only one watching. There were others out there, people who had started to notice the same pattern, who had begun to ask the questions that no one in the clinic dared to ask. Somewhere, deep in the shadows of Dr. Moore's reputation, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. But it would take more than just a nurse's suspicion to bring it to light. It would take someone brave enough to step into the darkness and unmask the deadly secret that lay beneath the surface. Of medical greatness, Dr. Elijah Moore's rise to prominence in the world of medicine was nothing short of meteoric. It was the kind of success that most people only dreamed of, an overnight sensation in an industry that took years to carve out a name. He wasn't just another doctor. He was a savant, an innovator, someone who saw the future of medicine in a way others couldn't. His early career was defined by breakthroughs, unprecedented surgeries, experimental treatments, and a seemingly endless list of patients whose lives he saved against all odds. Each successful operation, each glowing review from patients, was another step up the ladder. His reputation spread like wildfire across the city, then the country, and eventually, internationally. Dr. Moore was a man of quiet confidence, but it was the kind of confidence that inspired absolute trust. He didn't need to boast about his abilities. His results spoke louder than any words ever could. His colleagues admired him. Some looked up to him as a mentor. Others resented him for the attention he received. But all respected him. In a world where medical professionals prided themselves on their reputations, Dr. Moore's was untouchable. His name was synonymous with excellence, and his methods were seen as the future of healthcare. He was invited to speak at prestigious conferences, granted fellowships at the most esteemed medical societies, and awarded grants for research that most doctors could only dream of securing. At the heart of his empire was his Clinica Pristine facility located in the most affluent area of the city. It was sleek, modern, and designed with an almost clinical precision that mirrored Dr. Moore's approach to medicine. The waiting room was always full, with patients from all walks of life, hoping for a chance to sit in his chair. The buzz in the clinic was palpable. Nurses and administrative staff worked efficiently, keeping the schedule packed with appointments, consultations, and follow-ups. Dr. Moore's office was a sanctuary of sorts, where patients could speak to him directly, face-to-face, and feel the weight of his intelligence and care. It was here that he worked his magic, offering treatments for rare diseases that had baffled the medical world for decades. Each patient who left his office, armed with a diagnosis and treatment plan, left with a renewed sense of hope. His clinic became one of the best in the city, if not the country. People sought him out from across the globe, willing to travel hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles to receive his care. And when they came with reverence. The clinic wasn't just a place for healing. It was a symbol of trust, of miracles, of second chances. The media adored him, and the public adored him even more. He became a fixture in the media, with interviews and profiles lauding his intellect and vision. His patients were loyal, many of them returning time and time again for his care, not just because of his skill, but because of his ability to make them feel seen, valued, and understood. To them, Dr. Moore wasn't just a doctor, he was a savior. But with all the admiration came the inevitable pressure. As the clinic's success grew, so did the expectations. Everyone wanted a piece of him, journalists clamoring for interviews, medical conferences vying for his attendance, pharmaceutical companies offering lucrative partnerships. Dr. Moore, always the calm and collected professional, never showed a hint of strain. But even the most perfect facade has cracks, and the cracks in Dr. Moore's perfection began to show subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the way he responded to certain questions. It started with small things questions from patients or colleagues. That, at first, seemed innocuous, but over time, they began to chip away at the confidence he had worked so hard to cultivate. It was during a routine consultation, in the midst of a busy afternoon, that the first small seed of doubt was planted. A young woman in her early 30s sat across from him, nervously clutching her appointment folder. She had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder that had left her struggling for years, trying various treatments that hadn't worked. When Dr. Moore had suggested his new treatment, a cutting-edge therapy he had developed, she was eager to try anything that might bring relief. She had heard of his reputation and trusted that he was the man who could save her. But as Dr. Moore explained the procedure, her eyes narrowed slightly. "Is there any risk involved with this treatment?" she asked, her voice shaky but filled with genuine concern. "I've heard of similar treatments going wrong. Is this something that's been fully tested?" The question, though honest and valid, lingered in the air, hanging between them like a cloud. Dr. Moore's expression didn't falter. He smiled reassuringly, leaning forward slightly as he addressed her concerns. "Of course," he replied confidently, his voice smooth and persuasive. "This treatment has been designed specifically for patients like you. It's groundbreaking. Yes, but it's also extremely safe. We've conducted extensive trials, and the results have been nothing short of extraordinary." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the room. "Sometimes people are hesitant about new treatments, but I assure you, you are in the best hands possible. You trust me, don't you?" She nodded, though there was still a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But that was all it took. Dr. Moore's words, his presence, his confidence erased any lingering hesitation. She signed the consent forms without another word, the momentary doubt already fading into the background. What she didn't know, and what no one else knew, was that Dr. Moore's groundbreaking treatment was still in its experimental phase. Despite his confident assurances, It had never been fully tested in clinical trials, and there were risks he had chosen not to mention, risks he had decided to ignore. He had become so consumed with the desire to be the best, to be the doctor who could change the world, that the fine print, the little details, seemed irrelevant. His goal was bigger than just one patient, bigger than just one treatment. He saw himself as the future of medicine, and in that vision, there was no room for failure, no room for doubt. But as he reassured his patients, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his own ambition pressing down on him. Every day, the pressure mounted. More people were talking about him. More people were coming to him with their hopes and their diseases, and the stakes were growing higher. He knew that with success came expectations, and with those expectations came the ever-present fear of failure. And so, Dr. Moore's clinic continued to thrive, with each success feeding his growing sense of invincibility. Patients came in droves, and the press continued to sing his praises. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that the cracks were beginning to spread. Dr. Moore's obsession with perfection was blinding him to the dangers of the treatment he was offering. What had started as a simple desire to cure, the incurable had turned into something far more complicated and far more dangerous. The more he ignored the doubts that crept into his mind, the more those doubts began to solidify into something real. But he would not let go of his dream. He would not let anything or anyone get in the way of the legacy he was building. In the sterile white walls of his clinic, where miracles were supposed to happen, Dr. Moore was slowly stitching together his own downfall. And yet, in the midst of it all, he remained untouchable. His fame, his success, his charisma kept everyone, including his patients, believing in his genius. The questions were being asked, but the answers remained just out of reach. And so, Dr. Moore carried on, convinced that he was untouchable, that nothing could stop him from changing the world. But the storm was already gathering, and soon it would sweep through his life in a way he never saw coming. As Dr. Moore's fame continued to soar, so too did his sense of invincibility. The clinic became a temple of medical miracles, where patients flocked from all over, each one hopeful, each one trusting in the man who had the power to cure what others couldn't. His new treatment, still experimental, though he would never admit to any limitations, was touted as the cure-all for rare, life-threatening conditions that had once been considered untreatable. Patients who had suffered for years, sometimes decades, found new hope in Dr. Moore's assurances. The drug he was injecting them with promised to change their lives, to provide them with the relief they'd been denied for so long. But as the number of patients seeking treatment grew, so did the number of unexplained deaths. It started small, a few odd cases, some patients suffering complications after the injections. But soon, the deaths became more frequent. Young, healthy individuals, all seemingly perfectly fine before their appointments, suddenly collapsing after receiving the treatment. The symptoms were vague exhaustion, dizziness, sudden loss of consciousness, symptoms that could easily be attributed to the patient's pre-existing conditions. After all, no one could have predicted how quickly these conditions would progress. Dr. Moore brushed it off. His confidence remained unshaken, and he even became more adamant in promoting the treatment as safe and effective. It's natural to have concerns, but I assure you, the results speak for themselves, he would say, his voice as calm and convincing as ever. His patients, trusting him implicitly, believed him. They couldn't imagine that the very person they had entrusted with their care could be responsible for their sudden and mysterious deaths. But behind the scenes, the whispers started. Nurses began to notice a pattern. It was subtle, at first one or two deaths that seemed like coincidences, but the frequency began to rise. The staff, trained to be silent and professional, quietly exchanged their concerns. They hadn't been told the full details about the new drug Dr. Moore had been using, but the more they saw, the more they began to wonder if something wasn't right. Still, no one spoke out. The clinic's reputation was too important, Dr. Moore's position too powerful. They all feared the consequences of challenging the doctor who had given them their careers, their success. Then, the first high-profile death occurred. Dr. Moore's clinic had recently treated a respected city councilman, a well-known figure who had been suffering from a rare form of autoimmune disease. His condition had worsened over the years, and despite his trust in traditional medicine, he had come to Dr. Moore's clinic in search of a solution. The councilman's family had heard of Dr. Moore's reputation through word of mouth, and they had watched in awe as he performed what they believed to be a miracle. The treatment had seemed to be working at first, his symptoms improving, his energy levels increasing, but within days of receiving his final dose, he collapsed at a public event. The city was shocked. A man who had been a pillar of the community, someone who had survived years of illness, was now dead, taken from his family and the city that had trusted him. The doctors at the hospital attributed his death to an undetected heart condition. It was a logical explanation, one that could be easily accepted. But behind the scenes, a few sharp-eyed individuals couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Why had the councilman been doing so well, only to suddenly deteriorate so rapidly after receiving Dr. Moore's treatment? Was it possible that the drug, the one that was still being hailed as revolutionary, had something to do with it? The whispers spread quickly. A few close colleagues of Dr. Moore, people who had known him for years, began to privately question the treatment. They remembered the earlier doubts they'd brushed aside. But even as they asked the questions, their fear of speaking out weighed heavily on them. Dr. Moore was too powerful, too revered, to be questioned. And even though a few murmured about the possibility of a link between the drug and the deaths, the media quickly labeled the councilman's death a tragic accident, and the city moved on. But the story didn't end there. Not long after the councilman's death, another high-profile individual, this time a beloved local artist, died under similar circumstances. Once again, the treatment had seemed to work wonders at first. But just days after receiving the final dose, the artist collapsed in his studio, surrounded by canvases that would never be finished. The cause of death was similarly attributed to a sudden cardiac arrest. But once again, a few voices quietly asked the same question. Could this be linked to Dr. Moore's treatment? This time, the rumors couldn't be contained. The media, having caught wind of the growing number of deaths, began to take notice. Articles started appearing, asking whether the doctor's miracle cure might be too good to be true. The once untouchable Dr. Moore's reputation began to crack. But the clinic continued to see patients in droves. Even with the increasing death toll, people continued to trust him after all. He had saved so many lives, and the treatment had worked for so many others. The deaths were tragic, yes, but surely they were just isolated incidents, right? It wasn't just the media or the whispers within the medical community anymore. There was a growing undercurrent of suspicion among the patients themselves. Patients who had once been hopeful now began to question the risks of the treatment. And although the majority continued to trust in Dr. Moore, a small group of them hesitated. There were murmurs about his new treatment being untested, about its rushed approval. A few asked questions, but Dr. Moore dismissed them with his usual confidence. No, no, he'd say, his voice steady and calm, a reassuring smile on his face. This is the future of medicine. We're advancing, we're evolving. You trust me, don't you? And most of them did. They couldn't imagine that a man they trusted so completely, a man whose very name had become a symbol of hope, could ever be capable of something so dark. But as more bodies piled up each death and unexplained tragedy, each one contributing to the growing pile of evidence, no one seemed willing to acknowledge. The walls of Dr. Moore's perfect world began to close in on him. And the more the city ignored the signs, the more the whispers grew. There would come a time, he knew, when the world would no longer believe in his innocence. But by then, it would be too late. The lives lost would never be returned, and legend of Dr. Elijah Moore would be buried beneath the weight of the very treatments that had once made him famous. Dr. Moore's ego swelled with each success. The more lives he saved, the more he believed in his own brilliance. In his mind, the breakthrough he had made with his new treatment was not just a step forward in medicine, it was a leap. He was pushing boundaries, challenging the status quo, and reimagining what was possible. There were always risks with new treatments, he reasoned. Every medical advancement came with its share of casualties. The doctors who had pioneered surgeries Like heart transplants or organ replacements had faced similar doubts, and many had lost patients along the way. But their names were still remembered as pioneers, as heroes. And so, in his mind, his own actions were justified. The deaths? They were unfortunate, but in his eyes, they were collateral damage in a much bigger picture. What was one life lost if it meant hundreds, even thousands, could be saved? He told himself that these patients had been given a chance at life something they wouldn't have had otherwise. To him, it wasn't about the individual losses. It was about the legacy he was building, the revolution he was spearheading. And that was what mattered most. As the number of deaths grew, so too did his internal justification. He began to rationalize the deaths, telling himself that those who had died were the outliers, the ones whose bodies simply couldn't handle the new treatment. It's a sacrifice for progress, he would tell himself, as though the words themselves could alleviate the guilt gnawing at him. But deep down, Dr. Moore was beginning to feel something else, a quiet paranoia. It started small, a fleeting thought when he was alone, but it grew as the weeks passed. What if the deaths weren't just bad luck? What if the treatment was causing them? He dismissed it quickly, telling himself that if it weren't for his intervention, these people would still be suffering. They were just unfortunate exceptions. Every great mind faced resistance, and Dr. Moore was no different. The whispers from colleagues, the media attention, even the patients' families who started to ask uncomfortable questions, they were all distractions. He could see it now. The naysayers were jealous, frightened of the new world he was creating. And if they couldn't understand his vision, well, they would simply have to be left behind. The pressure began to mount, but Dr. Moore was no longer the empathetic, confident doctor he once was. He became distant, more focused on his work than on his patients. His eyes no longer met theirs with the same warmth. His smiles, once sincere, became rehearsed, a facade he wore to maintain control. When his colleagues voiced concern, suggesting that the treatment might need more oversight or a longer trial period, Dr. Moore's response was cold. "You don't understand," he would snap. "This is the future. We can't wait forever. People are dying right now. You want to keep waiting for permission? Or do you want to save lives?" His colleagues stopped challenging him. No one wanted to risk their place in the clinic, and they knew better than to question the man who held the power to make or break their careers. But the more they remained silent, the more Dr. Moore's paranoia took root. He became convinced that he was being sabotaged by jealous rivals, by underlings who didn't understand his genius, by the very patients he was trying to help. And as the number of deaths grew, so did his emotional detachment. Dr. Moore had once prided himself on his empathy, on the way he could sit with a patient, listen to their story, and offer hope. But now, those conversations felt like a chore. He didn't need to listen anymore. He had already made up his mind about what was best for them. The treatment was his vision, and no one understood it like he did. He had become the doctor who knew best, and his patients' feelings, their fears, their doubts didn't matter. What mattered was progress. What mattered was the legacy he was building. His detachment grew, and with it, his charm became more insidious. He had always been able to charm his patients and their families, to reassure them that they were in the best hands possible. But now, when families came to him, mourning the loss of their loved ones, his words were slick and rehearsed. "I know. This is hard," he would say, his voice smooth and sincere. "But the treatment you agreed to was the only chance they had. You knew the risks. You knew that this was a groundbreaking procedure, something no one else was doing. It was the only way to help them." He never once mentioned the deaths that had been linked to his treatment. He never spoke of the families who had lost their loved ones and were now asking the questions no one dared to answer. Instead, he painted himself as the hero, the only doctor brave enough to attempt something as revolutionary as his new drug. He knew how to play the game, how to use his charm to convince others that the treatment was still the right choice. When the widow of one of his earlier patients came to him, demanding answers about her husband's sudden death, Dr. Moore maintained his calm. He explained that her husband's condition had been far worse than anyone had realized, and that the treatment had given him more time than he ever would have had otherwise. It was a long shot, Dr. Moore said with a soft sigh. We did everything we could, but sometimes things don't work out. That doesn't mean we stop trying. It means we keep pushing forward. Your husband knew that. He understood what we were doing here. The widow, grief-stricken and desperate for answers, nodded, her face crumpling with emotion. She didn't question him. She couldn't. He was Dr. Moore, the man who had saved so many, a man with the answers. And so she left the clinic, her heart heavy, but her mind quieted by Dr. Moore's words. For Dr. Moore, this was nothing more than business as usual. He had perfected his technique, his ability to charm, to manipulate, to control the narrative. And with each passing day, his grip tightened. The more patients died, the more his conviction grew. He was the only one who truly understood the value of his work. If people didn't understand the cost, that wasn't his problem. He had made the hard choices. He had sacrificed what was necessary to create something that would change the world. But as the bodies stacked up and the whispers grew louder, a small part of Dr. Moore's mind began to wonder how long could he keep this up? How many more deaths would it take before the world started to ask the right questions? And when they did, would anyone believe him when he said it was all for the greater good? As Dr. Moore's treatment became more widely known, so did the number of patients seeking his care. They came from all walks of life, people who had struggled for years with rare conditions, debilitating diseases, or life-threatening ailments that other doctors had written off as untreatable. To them, Dr. Moore wasn't just another physician. He was their last hope. His reputation as the savior of the medical world, the one with the answers no one else had, gave them a sense of peace they hadn't felt in years. They trusted him completely, believing his promises of miraculous cures and better lives. Among these patients was Sarah Harper, a young mother of two who had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive form of lupus. Her condition had rapidly deteriorated, leaving her weak and unable to care for her children. She had tried every treatment available, but nothing seemed to work. Her family watched helplessly as she became a shadow of the vibrant woman she once was. When they heard about Dr. Moore's new treatment, they immediately saw it as the answer they had been waiting for. Sarah herself was cautious, but she trusted the glowing reports and the endorsements from others. "This is my chance," she said, looking at her husband Jim with a hopeful smile. "This is going to work. I just know it." Sarah's family supported her decision without hesitation. Jim, though nervous, felt a wave of relief. For once, there was hope. His wife had struggled for so long, and here was a man, a doctor, who promised to cure her, promised to give her back the life she had lost. Sarah walked into Dr. Moore's clinic with that same hope, her children's faces lighting up as they held her hand, excited for their mother's chance at a new life. But just a few days after receiving the treatment, Sarah's condition worsened. At first, it was small signs, a lingering dizziness, bouts of exhaustion, and a faint sense of weakness. But then she collapsed one evening while cooking dinner, and her family rushed her to the hospital. The doctors couldn't explain it. Her vital organs were shutting down, her heart was failing, and there was nothing they could do. Within hours, Sarah Harper was gone. Her family was devastated. Jim sat by her hospital bed, clutching her hand as the doctors delivered the news. His voice was hoarse as he whispered to her, begging her to wake up. "You can't leave me," he cried. "Not like this. Not after all we've been through." His eyes, filled with disbelief, scanned the room, looking for answers that weren't there. The hospital staff tried to comfort him, but it felt hollow. How could they explain this? How could they understand? Dr. Moore's name was the first to cross his mind. He had promised Sarah something no one else could. He had promised her a cure, and yet here she was. In the days that followed, Jim's grief turned to anger, but he had no one to direct it toward. He called Dr. Moore's office repeatedly, but the clinic never answered, leaving him with nothing but an overwhelming sense of loss. Sarah was just one of many who had placed their faith in Dr. Moore. There was also Marcus Steele, a businessman in his late 40s who had been living with a chronic heart condition. Marcus had been told he had only a few years to live. His condition was rare, but he had been managing it with the help of various medications. When he heard about Dr. Moore's treatment, he saw it as his last chance to defy the odds. His wife, Deborah, had heard of the doctor's miraculous results, and the two of them decided to give it a shot. Marcus, reluctant but hopeful, agreed. "Don't worry, darling," Deborah reassured him. "We're doing the right thing. This is the future of medicine." Deborah trusted Dr. Moore with their lives, believing that her husband had found the one person who could save him from an untimely death. Marcus, though skeptical, couldn't help but feel the pull of the hope that had eluded him for so long. But just days after receiving the treatment, Marcus's health began to deteriorate rapidly. His heart, already weak, began to fail at an alarming rate. His condition took a turn for the worse, and before long, he was hospitalized. Deborah could barely keep her composure as doctors worked frantically to stabilize him. "He was fine," she whispered to herself in disbelief. "He was fine before this." Her mind raced as she tried to connect the dots. She had trusted Dr. Moore. They had trusted him. And now, Marcus was slipping away, his life slipping through her fingers. Like Sarah's family, Deborah clung to the hope that this was just another complication, that Marcus would pull through. But the days passed, and it became clear that no matter what the doctors did, his condition continued to worsen. Eventually, his organs began to shut down, and Marcus died. His life taken by the very treatment that had been promised to save him. Deborah was left in a state of disbelief. Her mind struggled to make sense of the events, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't understand. The man who had given her hope, Dr. Moore, had taken her husband's life. She felt a heavy weight of guilt, as though she should have known better, as though something in her had ignored the warnings. She couldn't bear the thought of telling their children, couldn't find the words to explain why their father was gone. The house they had built together, the future they had planned gone, all because they had trusted the wrong person. Other families soon began to speak out, though not all were as vocal as Jim and Deborah. For many, the shock was still too fresh. They held their grief close, unwilling to believe that the very treatment they had trusted could be the cause of their loved ones' deaths. But over time, more families started to question what had happened. They began to wonder if there was a connection between the mysterious deaths and Dr. Moore's treatment. Some patients even sought second opinions from other doctors. But by the time they did, it was too late. Dr. Moore's diagnosis was final, and their trust in his expertise led them to overlook any doubts they might have had. The emotional toll on the families was unimaginable. Each new death added another layer of grief, another heartbreak that no one could have prepared for. The contrast between the hope they had felt when they entered Dr. Moore's clinic and the tragedy they faced when they left was stark. What had once been a place of healing had become a place of sorrow. But Dr. Moore never saw it that way. He was too caught up in his own ambition to notice the lives he had destroyed. To him, the patients were numbers, casualties in a game much bigger than any individual life. He had convinced himself that the risks were worth it, that the breakthroughs would overshadow the losses. But for the families, each death was personal. Each death was a reminder that someone they loved had been taken too soon, under the false promise of salvation. As the number of unexplained deaths linked to Dr. Moore's treatment continued to grow, the city began to stir with suspicion. Families were mourning, whispers were circulating, but no one was taking action. Dr. Moore's reputation was still untouchable, his name still associated with hope and healing. Yet, in the shadows, a few people started connecting the dots. And, for the first time, someone was determined to uncover the truth. Mariah Grant, an investigative journalist who had built a career on uncovering the stories that others didn't want to tell, had heard murmurs about the rising death toll. She had written articles on a variety of subjects, many of them about the intersection of medicine and corruption, but something about this story struck her. It wasn't just the deaths themselves. It was the pattern. It was the rising number of patients who had all received Dr. Moore's experimental treatment. At first, she brushed it off as coincidence, but the more she dug, the more the pieces of the puzzle started to fit. She began by sifting through the media reports, looking for any mention of the strange string of deaths linked to the clinic. The coverage was sparse, only a few lines buried in the back of newspapers or mentioned briefly in the evening news. What stood out to her, however, was that many of the deaths seemed to share similar characteristics: young, otherwise healthy individuals, all dying suddenly from unexplained causes. The doctors and hospitals involved were quick to blame heart conditions, seizures, or other natural causes, but there was something about it all that didn't sit right with Mariah. Her instincts told her there was more to the story, and so she dug deeper. She began tracking the names of the deceased, gathering any available information on their medical histories. After a few days, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Each person who had died had visited Dr. Moore's clinic, and each had been injected with the same treatment, the same experimental drug. The more she looked into it, the clearer it became that the drug was at the center of the mystery. But what was it exactly? What was Dr. Moore really injecting his patients with? Determined to find out, Mariah reached out to former employees of Dr. Moore's clinic. At first, she received nothing but silence. But after a few weeks, she got an anonymous tip from someone who had worked there for years and had watched the events unfold. The tip came in the form of a message left in her inbox, with the subject line, "You're on the right track, but it's worse than you think." The message contained nothing but a series of names of patients who had died in the past few months and a strange warning. The drug isn't just experimental. It's untested and dangerous. We were told to ignore the side effects. We were told to keep quiet. Mariah's heart raced as she read the message. She knew this was it. She had been on the right track all along, but now she needed the proof. She needed evidence that would tie Dr. Moore directly to the deaths. She started making calls to hospitals, requesting patient records and autopsy reports, under the guise of a journalist doing a follow-up on the deaths. Most hospitals complied, but some were more reluctant, especially when it came to obtaining sensitive medical records. One of the nurses, who had worked closely with Dr. Moore's patients, offered her a lead that would change everything. She described a small locked room in the back of the clinic, one that most of the staff didn't have access to. In that room, there were large containers of the drug, labeled only with Dr. Moore's private code. There were no manufacturer labels, no chemical breakdowns, nothing that identified the substance. The nurse explained that Dr. Moore had been using the drug on a trial basis, despite the lack of formal approval. She told Mariah that there had been talks of making the drug public, even though no clinical trials had been completed. Mariah's mind was racing as she pieced together the puzzle. Dr. Moore had been injecting his patients with a drug that had not been fully tested, and now people were dying because of it. But it wasn't just an oversight, it was deliberate. Dr. Moore had chosen to push forward with an unproven, risky treatment without informing his patients of the potential dangers. Her next step was to secure the drug itself, or at least find out what it was. Using her connections, she managed to gain access to a hospital's pharmacy records, where she discovered that the chemical being used in Dr. Moore's treatments was a rare industrial compound, one that had no place in medical care. It was used in high-risk industrial processes, like metal etching and paint stripping. In small doses, it could be lethal, slowly poisoning the body and causing complete organ failure. The revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. Dr. Moore had been injecting this toxic substance into his patients, knowing full well the risks involved. And the worst part was that it wasn't just an isolated incident. This was systemic. The drug had been administered to dozens, if not hundreds of people, all of them unsuspecting and trusting Dr. Moore's expertise. Mariah's heart pounded as she gathered the evidence. She knew she had to take this to the authorities, but she also knew the risks. Dr. Moore was too powerful, too well connected. He could easily make her story disappear. But she couldn't back down. People were dying, and the public needed to know the truth. She reached out to a trusted medical investigator, someone who had a reputation for taking on high-profile cases. Together, they began working through Dr. Moore's records, comparing the patient deaths with the timelines of when they had received the treatment. The investigator, an experienced professional who had seen more than his fair share of medical scandals, was shocked by the findings. There was no denying it. Dr. Moore had been experimenting on his patients without their consent, disregarding safety protocols, and covering up the risks of the treatment. The substance he was using was not only unapproved, it was dangerous. Breakthrough came when the investigator uncovered a hidden batch of emails from Dr. Moore to an overseas supplier. The emails outlined exactly what Dr. Moore had requested: large quantities of the dangerous compound. He had been purchasing the substance in bulk, far beyond the needs of any legitimate clinical trial. The emails made it clear that Dr. Moore knew what he was doing. He had been aware of the drug's risks, but had chosen to ignore them, all in the name of making a name for himself. Dr. Moore had crossed a line. He wasn't just pushing the boundaries of modern medicine. He had been playing God, using real people as experiments. The investigators now had enough evidence to expose him for what he truly was: a man who had chosen to gamble with lives for his own gain. As Mariah and the investigator prepared to take their findings public, they knew the consequences would be far-reaching. But they also knew that they had no choice. The truth needed to come out, no matter what it cost. The lives of the victims had to be remembered. Their stories had to be told. And Dr. Moore? He would be held accountable for the lives he had destroyed. The walls of Dr. Elijah Moore's pristine clinic, once a symbol of medical genius and unwavering success, began to close in around him. After weeks of growing whispers and mounting evidence, the authorities were finally closing in. A medical investigator armed with hard facts, damning emails, and testimonies from former staff had assembled a case strong enough to make an arrest. The walls of Dr. Moore's empire, so carefully built on the trust of his patients and the admiration of his peers, were now crumbling, piece by piece. One afternoon, as Dr. Moore sat in his office, reviewing the latest research papers on his experimental drug, the door opened without warning. A tall, steely-eyed investigator stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with an immediate sense of tension. Behind him, 2 officers stood quietly, the weight of their presence undeniable. Dr. Moore didn't look up from his papers at first. He continued flipping through the reports, the steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead almost comforting. "It's all going to come together soon, I promise," he muttered to himself, convinced that his work, his brilliance, would be vindicated. But when the investigator's voice cut through the silence, it was like a jagged shard of ice in the air. "Dr. Moore, we need to talk." His heart skipped. He knew that voice. It was the voice of someone who had been in his world before, someone who knew how the game was played. Dr. Moore looked up, his expression unreadable at first. Then, as his eyes met the investigator's, a flicker of unease passed through him. "I have nothing to say to you," Dr. Moore replied, his voice cold and sharp. "My work speaks for itself." The investigator didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Dr. Moore. "You're responsible for the deaths of over a dozen people, Dr. Moore. We have the evidence. We have the witnesses. Your breakthrough treatment. It's been poisoning your patients, and we can prove it." Dr. Moore stood, suddenly feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. The walls of his clinic, which had once felt like a fortress, now felt like a cage, pressing in on him from every angle. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was all wrong. He had saved lives. He had changed the world. People had trusted him. He was on the verge of something groundbreaking, something that could revolutionize medicine. How could they not see that? "My intentions were noble," Dr. Moore said, his voice rising with a hint of desperation. "I've given people hope. I've given them a chance. The risks, the casualties, they're unfortunate. Yes, but they're necessary. For progress, for the future. Do you not understand that?" The investigator's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "Progress? At what cost, Dr. Moore?" "Those people are dead. You took their lives for your experiment, for your ego. You didn't just push the boundaries of medicine. You crossed a line, and now people are paying the price." Dr. Moore's mind raced. He wanted to defend himself, to argue, to fight back. But the more he tried to rationalize, the more he felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. His heart raced, his palms began to sweat, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure of the next move. "I did what I had to do," Dr. Moore said, his voice quivering slightly. "I didn't mean for them to die. But it was necessary. We were on the verge of something extraordinary. This is bigger than just one person. This is for the future of medicine. Do you understand? Don't you see? It was a sacrifice for progress. The investigator didn't answer. He merely reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, dropping it onto Dr. Moore's desk with a heavy thud. The folder was filled with documents, emails, medical records, patient death reports, all neatly stacked and carefully catalogued. Evidence, proof. Dr. Moore could feel the blood drain from his face as he leafed through the pages, his hand trembling. The weight of each page felt like a hammer striking the nail in the coffin of his career. You're done. Dr. Moore, the investigator said quietly. There's nowhere left to hide. This isn't about saving lives anymore. It's about taking responsibility for the lives you've taken. The words hit harder than anything Dr. Moore had ever experienced. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He couldn't speak. His world, the world he had built so carefully, was falling apart. The foundation was cracked, and the pieces were slipping through his fingers like sand in the wind. All those years of hard work, all the lives he had saved, had it been for nothing? Had it all been a lie? As the investigator turned to leave, Dr. Moore's gaze lingered on the folder of evidence. He felt his stomach churn, the guilt creeping up his throat. Was this the price of his ambition? Had he sacrificed everything for fame, for recognition? Was it worth it? The investigator paused at the door, his voice cutting through the silence one last time. The public's starting to hear about this. The media's already all over it. Your reputation? It's crumbling. You're going to be exposed for what you are. A fraud. And then, as quickly as he had come, the investigator and the officers were gone, leaving Dr. Moore alone in his office, the weight of his actions crushing him. His mind spiraled as he stared at the folder on his desk. He couldn't escape it. The truth had caught up with him. The days that followed were a blur. News outlets exploded with stories of the investigation, covering every aspect of the case. The public outcry was immediate and relentless. People who had once praised him now turned against him. The faces that had once trusted him, who had once placed their lives in his hands, now questioned every word he had ever said. The once glowing reputation of Dr. Elijah Moore began to disintegrate in front of his eyes. Former patients spoke out, sharing their stories of what had gone wrong, of the trust they had placed in him, and of the grief they now carried. Families of the deceased demanded answers, their voices loud and full of rage. Social media was ablaze with condemnation, and the medical community distanced itself from him once and for all. Dr. Moore's clinic, once the beacon of medical excellence, was forced to close its doors. The name he had worked so tirelessly to build now became synonymous with betrayal, with greed, with the lives lost in the pursuit of his ambitions. As the days turned into weeks, Dr. Moore's mind began to spiral into a deep, suffocating paranoia. His phone rang constantly with threats, with angry voices demanding justice. The guilt weighed on him like an anchor, pulling him deeper into despair. He spent sleepless nights pacing the halls of his empty clinic, haunted by the faces of the patients he had killed, the families he had betrayed. He tried to justify his actions to himself, to rationalize the risks he had taken, but nothing could erase the faces of the people he had failed. There was a moment, late one night, when Dr. Moore stood before a mirror, looking at the man he had become. His once pristine suit hung loosely on his frame, his hair unkempt, his face gaunt and drawn. He barely recognized the person staring back at him. He had once been a doctor who changed lives. Now he was just a man who had taken them. He whispered. To his reflection, the words barely audible. Was it worth it? For the first time in years, Dr. Moore wasn't sure of the answer. The world had turned against him. His reputation was in tatters, his clinic destroyed, his name forever associated with death. The legacy he had fought so hard to build had been shattered. And now, as the reality of his actions fully sank in, Dr. Moore was left to face the consequences of the choices he had made. It wasn't about saving lives anymore. It was about surviving the truth and realizing, too late, that the price of fame had been far too high. The air in Dr. Moore's clinic was thick with tension. The walls that had once been filled with the quiet hum of hope and healing now seemed to close in on him. For the past few weeks, his life had been a series of frantic meetings, lawyer consultations, and desperate attempts to stave off the inevitable. The media coverage, the public outcry, the patient complaints, they had all culminated in one undeniable truth. Dr. Moore's empire was crumbling, and there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. As Dr. Moore walked through the halls of his clinic that morning, his mind raced. The once bright and welcoming corridors now felt hollow, as though even the walls themselves were mourning the life they had known. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some sympathetic, some filled with distrust. The nurses moved quickly and purposefully, trying to avoid his gaze, while others whispered among themselves. The patients, who had once filled the waiting rooms in eager anticipation, now arrived with a sense of trepidation, some of them even leaving as soon as they saw the news reports plastered on the walls. Dr. Moore was a man on the edge. His mind raced, his steps heavy with the weight of the moment. There was no escaping the growing reality that his past achievements, his groundbreaking work, his status as a pioneer in the medical community would soon be overshadowed by the horrors he had caused. His hands, once steady as he performed life-saving surgeries, now trembled slightly as he walked toward his office. There was no turning back. The past weeks had been filled with nothing but the bitter taste of guilt, shame, and the relentless pressure of impending exposure. And then the door to his office opened. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway, and a group of uniformed officers entered the clinic, their presence undeniable. A hush fell over the entire space as the staff froze, unsure of what to do or say. Dr. Moore didn't even flinch as they approached him. He had known this moment was coming, but the reality of it, the finality of it, still took him by surprise. He had built this life from the ground up. His reputation had been everything to him. And now it was all falling apart in front of his eyes. "Dr. Elijah Moore, you are under arrest," one of the officers said, his voice cold and unyielding. The words hit like a physical blow. A man who had once been a trusted and revered figure in the world of medicine was now nothing more than a criminal, shackled by the weight of his own choices. He stood motionless, his heart pounding, his mind numb. For a moment he wondered if he was dreaming, if this was some kind of nightmare that he would wake up from. But the cold metal of the handcuffs against his wrists told him that it was real. This was his reality now. The officers didn't waste time. They moved quickly, expertly, as they guided him through the clinic. His colleagues and staff watched in stunned silence, some too afraid to meet his eyes, others too shocked to speak. The once bustling clinic was now an eerie quiet, a stillness that reflected the devastation of the moment. No one knew what to say, or even if they should say anything at all. Dr. Moore had been their leader, their inspiration, and now they were witnessing his fall from grace. As the officers led him down the hallway, past the treatment rooms, past the sterile white walls that had been the backdrop to so many lives changed, Dr. Moore couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. The faces of patients who had trusted him flashed in his mind, those who had come to him in desperation, who had believed in him completely. He had promised them hope. He had promised them a chance at life. And now those very promises lay in ruins, destroyed by his own ambition, by his desire to push the limits of what was possible, no matter the cost. The silence that followed his arrest was deafening. The staff stood frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fear. The patients who were waiting in the lobby watched in stunned silence as Dr. Moore was led out of the building, their trust shattered in an instant. The man they had looked up to, the doctor who had healed their loved ones, was now a criminal, his reputation in tatters. As Dr. Moore was escorted out of the clinic, the weight of his fall became all too real. The clinic doors swung open, and he was led into the waiting police cars, the flashing lights reflecting off the windows. The faces of the patients who had once trusted him, the families he had helped, the colleagues who had once admired him, all of them would now have to live with the knowledge that they had been deceived. Dr. Moore sat in the back of the car, his expression unreadable, staring straight ahead as the officers drove away. The weight of what he had done, the lives he had taken, the people he had hurt, began to sink in. There was no more deflecting responsibility, no more justifications. He had taken it too far. He had ignored the warning signs. And now there was nothing left but the consequences. As the car pulled away from the clinic, Dr. Moore couldn't help but feel the weight of his own failure. His dreams, his ambitions, his legacy, all of it had been built on a lie. His clinic, once a symbol of hope, now stood as a monument to his destruction. And as the car drove further away, leaving the clinic behind, Dr. Moore couldn't escape the haunting thought that it had all been for nothing. He had spent his life chasing recognition, striving for a place in medical history. And in the end, he had lost everything. The aftermath of Dr. Elijah Moore's arrest was nothing short of a medical earthquake. The news broke like wildfire, spreading across television screens, news sites, and social media. Headlines screamed of the once celebrated doctor-turned-criminal, of his fall from grace, and of the countless lives lost in the wake of his ambition. For the public, it was almost impossible to process. Dr. Moore had been a figure of hope, of modern medicine's bright future. Now, he was a symbol of its darkest corruption. The medical community was in shock. Colleagues who had once praised Dr. Moore for his groundbreaking work were now left questioning their own practices, wondering if they had missed the warning signs, if they had turned a blind eye to the ethical dilemmas he had ignored in his pursuit of greatness. The investigation forced a re-evaluation of the very foundation of modern medicine. How much trust should be placed in a doctor's word? And at what point does ambition become a danger to those it seeks to heal? For many, Dr. Moore's case opened up wounds in the medical profession, revealing the dark side of fame and the human cost of unchecked innovation. His trial would not only expose his wrongdoings, but also ignite a firestorm of debates about ethics, the limits of medical experimentation, and the trust patients place in the hands of those sworn to heal them. But it was the families of the victims who felt the full brunt of Dr. Moore's betrayal. Their grief was compounded by an overwhelming sense of guilt. How could they have trusted him so completely? How had they allowed him to inject their loved ones with a treatment that, in the end, had only killed them? For Jim Harper, the loss of his wife Sarah had been devastating, but it was the overwhelming sense of betrayal that cut deepest. Every day, he woke up with the cold realization that he had placed his trust in a man who had taken everything from him. His children, once full of hope and excitement for their mother's recovery, now had to grow up without her. No amount of justice could undo the damage done, and Jim found himself struggling to rebuild his life. Deborah Steele, who had lost her husband Marcus, spent her days at the clinic where Dr. Moore had once worked, now empty and desolate. She had become a quiet advocate for the other victims, speaking out in the media, but the pain never left her. Every moment she spent at Marcus's grave felt like a reminder of the life that was taken too soon. She would never again feel the warmth of his hand in hers or hear his voice in the quiet moments at home. The loss had irrevocably shattered her sense of safety, of trust. The families began to come together to demand answers. They sought justice, but the healing process felt elusive, distant, and unattainable. The legal system, which had once been a source of comfort, now seemed like another institution that had failed them. The deaths of their loved ones had been covered up, excused, and explained away as coincidences. And it took time and an overwhelming amount of courage for them to come together and fight back. For every family that spoke out, there were others too shattered to do so, their grief still too raw to process. As Dr. Moore's trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension. The prosecution presented their case with clinical precision. They laid out the evidence: patient records, emails from Dr. Moore to suppliers, testimonies from former staff, and the toxicology reports linking his experimental drug to the deaths of his patients. It was clear that Dr. Moore had violated every medical protocol, that he had used his patients as unwitting guinea pigs, disregarding their safety for the sake of his ambition. The substance he had injected them with had caused organ failure, the consequences of which were both slow and agonizing. The evidence was undeniable, and the families of the victims sat in the courtroom, silently reliving their loss. But Dr. Moore's defense team remained steadfast. arguing that he had no malicious intent, that he had believed in the treatment, and that his actions were driven by a desire to save lives, not destroy them. They painted Dr. Moore as a well-meaning doctor, someone who had simply been too eager to push the boundaries of medicine. They argued that the treatment was still in its experimental stages, that the risks had been made clear to the patients, and that no one had forced them to undergo the procedure. But it was a weak defense, one that could not erase the cold, hard facts before the court. The families of the victims listened as Dr. Moore's defense tried to justify the unjustifiable, and they were filled with an overwhelming sense of injustice. How could they possibly accept that their loved ones had died because of a misunderstanding? How could anyone believe that someone who had knowingly injected a deadly substance into their bodies could be anything but a criminal? Dr. Moore's own words, his earlier dismissals of the concerns raised by patients and staff, painted a picture of a man who had become consumed by his ego, willing to sacrifice anyone to achieve his own vision of greatness. The trial stretched on, but the outcome became more certain with each passing day. The emotional toll on the families was clear. Every time a new piece of evidence was introduced, they felt the sting of the betrayal all over again. Each piece of testimony was a reminder of what they had lost, a reminder that no matter how much justice they fought for, it would never bring back the people they loved. And as the trial neared its conclusion, they found themselves wondering if they would ever truly heal from the wounds Dr. Moore had caused. In the end, Dr. Moore was found guilty on all major counts. The courtroom was filled with a sense of finality, though it was tempered by the knowledge that nothing would truly undo the damage that had been done. His once pristine reputation was shattered beyond repair. The man who had once been hailed as a medical genius was now a symbol of medical corruption, of unchecked ambition, and of the catastrophic consequences of placing too much trust in one person's vision. The trial had ended, but for the families left behind, the journey was far from over. Justice had been served, but it did little to heal the emotional wounds. The pain of losing someone so suddenly, so violently, could not be erased by a conviction, no matter how severe. For Jim, Deborah, and the others who had lost loved ones, the tragedy was a daily reminder of how their trust had been betrayed, of how the doctor who had promised them hope had instead taken everything away. They were left to carry the heavy burden of grief, knowing that, in the end, they had been victims of a man who was willing to sacrifice their loved ones for the sake of his own legacy. And as Dr. Moore's name faded from the headlines, a shadow lingered. It was a reminder of the dangerous power that a single person could hold, and how sometimes the very trust that is placed in them can become the weapon that destroys everything. Dr. Elijah Moore's fall from grace left the city in shock, and his name became synonymous with betrayal. Once celebrated as a visionary in medicine, he was now remembered as a cautionary tale, his ambition and ego overshadowed by the lives he destroyed. The families of the victims, though seeking justice, were left with nothing but grief and shattered trust. Their loved ones were gone, and no amount of court rulings or public outcry could bring them back. Each day they struggled to move forward, haunted by the knowledge that the very man they trusted had been the cause of their suffering. As Dr. Moore sat in his prison cell, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. His reputation was irrevocably tarnished, his career obliterated. He had been a man of greatness, now reduced to a symbol of medical corruption. The city had turned its back on him, but the true extent of his damage went deeper than anyone had imagined. But as time passed, whispers began to surface, carried on the lips of those who knew the darker side of medicine. Other doctors, other treatments unapproved, dangerous procedures that never made it to the public eye. Were there more like Dr. Moore, people driven by ambition to the point of recklessness? The question lingered in the shadows, leaving a chilling sense of uncertainty. Even with Dr. Moore's trial concluded, the door to more deadly secrets remained slightly ajar.